Thank you, Hassan and Randy. We're incredibly honored to have you here with us and sharing your insights and all that you do. So thank you again. And we now welcome the next panel to the stage. We'll be led by Sam Whitehorn, a Washington veteran and co-founder of Elevate Government Affairs. Sam has been in the trenches on transportation policy for over 30 years, holding key positions on the Senate Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee, including senior counsel on the Aviation Subcommittee, deputy staff director and general counsel, and briefly staff director. He was also senior attorney at both the DOT General Counsel's Office and the Civil Aeronautics Board. Sam knows aviation, and he knows the rigors and pressures of the Senate and House. Sam will introduce the panel, so now please join me in welcoming Sam.
Can everybody hear me? No. Plan B. What about now? Yes.
Yep. All
right. Panel is coming up, and what we decided to do is have everybody introduce themselves rather than myself introducing all of my friends. But it is a pleasure to be here to talk about these issues with all of you. And Steve, you want to go first?
Thank you very much. I had a bit of a back spasm this morning, and I shouldn't be teasing Sam about being old, which I was teasing him during the phase introduction. But with my back spasm, I feel like I'm living in a glass house here. This is Steve Neuman. I'm Vice President of Global Government Affairs at American Airlines. Spent a number of years working in government, much of them in state government. My last role was with the Governor of Rhode Island, who's now the Secretary of Commerce, and thrilled to have an opportunity to be here and participating with folks on so many important issues.
Good morning, everyone. Drew Jacoby with the Regional Airline Association.
I'm Kate Geldaker, Federal Government Affairs for Alaska Airlines.
Bobby Fraser with Atlas Air Worldwide, a cargo airline that you may have heard of. I'm Director of Government Affairs and Public Policy, and spent time working at DOT and FAA and also in the Senate with the Transportation Subcommittee.
So just to put this in perspective, Senate, House, Senate. So Drew is outnumbered, but Rob Chamberlin should be joining us. He's running late, I know. But we do want to talk about the next couple of months, what we think will happen in aviation, what we think will happen in the election, and then also pivot to our take on what's going forward. But there are also some things that we also want to discuss that I think Bobby in particular will want to raise is what happened during COVID and how the system performed, the supply chain, and also then talk about some of the core issues that are really confronting all of us as we try and fly and get through airports and all of that. So I do want to mention one thing. Randy mentioned the glass cockpit for Southwest Airlines. I recall when the FAA was rebuilding the air traffic computer systems and they wanted to digitalize everything and put it on computers, the controllers wanted paper flight strips. So that they had to go back, I think ITT had the contract at the time, and redesign things. And it cost millions and millions of dollars. And GAO criticized the FAA for the cost overruns, but it was because the controllers at the time weren't ready for the technological change. And the industry is about to go through in the next 3 to 5 to 7 years of technological change, and we're going to really look at new technologies, new fueling systems, new energy sources for airports that really will change lots and lots of things. So I'll stop there and ask a couple of questions, if that's okay with you, and all of you feel free to answer. But in the next 3 months, and I'm going to break this up, the next 3 months, and then we'll go to next year. The next 3 months between now and the end of the year, what do you see happening in the aviation system with the FAA, with DOT, with the potential administrator and the like? Steve?
Well, certainly I think it's no secret that a lot of the attention over the next 3 months is going to be focused on the election. And so in a certain sense, when you think about Congress, there's very little is likely to get done on much of anything, including aviation, on the congressional side. Having said that, you named a number of topics there, DOT, FAA, and otherwise, where there could be some activity, and one of the most important ones is the pending nomination of Mr. Washington to run the FAA. That is, proceeding through going through the process in the Senate Commerce Committee, and I think there's at least remains an intention to try and have some hearings on Mr. Washington before the election. So I think that's going to take up a lot of space, and certainly, as you know, senators like to use their time in hearings like that to talk about the broader issues in the industry that are important to them. So I think we'll get a window into what's going on. The other issue that I think continues to be important is some of the operational challenges that the airline industry had over the summertime, and I know certainly American Airlines was not immune to that, and we had some challenges over the summertime. I think the two things are, number one, the industry in general, and including American, seems to have largely turned the corner, which I'm very happy to say. And if you look at Americans, that's the one I'm familiar with, our completion factor and our on-time performance, they're much improved. But I think there's going to continue to be questions about how the Congress and the regulatory agencies respond. You recently saw DOT put out a dashboard relating to some of the way that customers are treated during irregular operations, and I think that's going to continue to take up some energy, hopefully less energy, the quicker and more intensely that airline operations improve.
Drew? Yeah, I think Stephen covered it related to what we can expect from Congress with Phil Washington's pending nomination, being the big activity in the aviation space, apart from what eventually gets incorporated into an omnibus via the Probst bills. I mean, beyond that, within the industry, that's going to affect members of Congress in their day-to-day. Of course, they travel multiple times every week, so they're going to continue, I think, to see to experience some frustration, right? Even if we're completing more flights, our performance is better, whether or not we get the credit for that is kind of a lagging indicator sometimes, right? There's a lot of frustration out there.
I would say there's no such thing as credit. It's either pain or lack of pain, but there's never credit.
So that'll still be out there, right? The pilot shortage is still going to be making news in the headlines, still going to be impacting small communities. And I saw a couple of stories, just this morning about, airports are getting more crowded. Customer satisfaction at airports is down. So it just doesn't make for a very happy travel experience right now, given elevated ticket prices on top of it.
Okay.
Yeah, so I don't repeat those. I agree with those pieces being there. But the other thing what we're going to be watching in aviation, a lot of us all came together around the SAF Thunders tax credit. So the implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act and looking at Treasury and the IRS, and are they getting those tax credits out in time for the January 1st implementation date, and then watching the blending producer industry for SAF. What opportunities are there? Is it making a difference so that we can all adjust and have time? Because I think that there's a possibility for additional action being necessary in the sustainability space as we all look to lower emissions in the FAA reauthorization. So this is kind of a time to assess and analyze and make sure that implementation timeline carries forward. But I agree we're under a close watch, not just in that area, but in terms of making sure that we maintain our small community air service. And at Alaska Airlines, we've done that, but at the same time, we've reduced the size of our regional fleet at Horizon. But great, great future ahead. We want to get back to that and make sure we're able to get into a good place of growth. I think one of the things that, as we look to FAA reauthorization next year, the whole industry should really think about the need to educate more of our government officials, because we've all been through the pandemic. It's been crazy. We've been going through a lot of ups and downs and new things coming at us. But we also have a whole bunch of brand new staff on the Hill who will be writing this FAA reauthorization. reauthorization. So we want to make sure that they understand the ins and outs of the industry, all the different dynamics of the industry, the new innovations, et cetera, and take this time, both in these 3 months and the beginning of next year, as they're all looking to set priorities for their bosses and help build a strong FAA reauthorization so that we can have another 5-year one.
Yep. So well said to everything. I agree with all of that. You know, a couple things about the election, and you know, as it comes. I mean, I think it's, you know, depending on how the Senate and House shakes out. The good thing for aviation and transportation in general is it tends to be an area where there's a lot of consensus, where members come together and work out a deal and can get something done for the good of everyone. It tends to be that kind of an issue, which is great. I think we'll learn a lot about members' priorities, particularly in the Senate, as they go through their nomination process for Phil Washington, and you know, kind of get a sense of where things might end up depending on the new leaders of the committees. But I think one thing is sure, all of them want to commit to working on the FAA reauth and doing it in a 5-year fashion. I think for Atlas, one of the things that we're paying attention to, it's been in the news, but it tends to be more of a cargo issue, is supply chains. And you know, we've just averted a rail strike that could have been disastrous for the economy. We're coming up on a very busy time of year for us and our customers with the holiday season. So it's a very, you know, so any disruptions that impact the passenger carriers can impact us. And of course, that's something we're paying attention to closely, where, you know, everything is so interconnected in the supply chain, because the goods go from truck to port to rail, sometimes to air. And we often come in when there's challenges to disruptions to surface modes of transportation. So that's what we're paying attention to.
Kate, you mentioned educating the staffers and the change that's going to come. I mean, I forgot the number of retirements in the House, but it's, you know, 60, 70 members. In the Senate, there's a handful also. So there'll be a sea change of people coming in with the election. And I think my personal take is, I think Bobby's right. Aviation is generally pretty bipartisan. There's a couple of things on either side that tend to get in the way, but we were talking to Rick Larson the other day, and he and Sam Graves, either way, are going to get along and get things done. It'll be interesting to see the Senate with Senator Cantwell and Senator Cruz. That's a different dynamic, but all of yours take on what that might mean, any disagreements that it should be pretty bipartisan? Steve?
I generally think it'll be pretty bipartisan. You know, I think perhaps not surprisingly, lots of the attention gets focused on some of the areas where there isn't bipartisanship, and I know that you know, that there's certainly going to be some intensity around labor issues. There may be some intensity around you know, preemption. You saw a letter from a number of state attorneys general, you know, seeking, you know, to chip away at federal preemption. So query whether that's going to be a plot line when the FAA reauthorization bill happens. And then, you know, I think sustainability can be another one where there's you know, kudos to Mr. Brownlee, or excuse me, Ms. Brownlee and Mr. Kildee and Mr. Schneider and others who forged a really good bipartisan process on SAF, and so it was nice to see that come together. But there, you know, that I worry sometimes that sustainability can be a fragile piece, and that can get broken easily.
Mm-hmm. Drew?
Yeah, no, I think in the Senate, I mean, the big question is, to your point, how are Cruz and Cantwell going to work together, right? You know, he's never been in a position before of leading a committee. We all know his reputation. It seems like he's running for president again. So how does that interact in the context of, you know, this is a bill where you need to work in a bipartisan fashion and focus on, you know, the broader priorities of what it takes to, you know, create a safe, you know, continue the record of a safe aviation industry. And, you know, how does that, you know, all fit into getting something done and working with your colleagues? And that remains to be seen. I think in the House, you know, if Republicans take it, I have no doubt that Graves and Larson, the members on those committees, can work together well. But what's the expectation of all the members off the committee? What's the expectation of leadership? Is their expectation going to be that it's going to be a bill that can pass only with Republican votes as that party drifts more and more to the right? Which, you know, surely, I mean, they can certainly pass it that way. I mean, both sides have passed bills that way. But then if the Senate puts together a bipartisan product and they go to conference, the House's hand is weakened in that extent. So I think, you know, there are going to be a lot of interesting dynamics that are going to have to be navigated that don't necessarily lend themselves to, you know, an on-time bill.
You mentioned Senator Cruz. I know he's going to be here later. The interesting about, and not just Senator Cruz, Texas senators have three fairly small airlines located in their state, which always made...
I'm only aware of the one.
and me too. But it always made it a challenge for the members to make decisions if pitting one against the other. Kate, you've got Washington State, which is a lot easier to deal with.
Yeah, well, you know, I think we've been working very closely with, you know, all the members of the committees, but having Senator Cantwell, you know, continue chair of our ranking member, whatever happens in the election of the Commerce Committee, I think is a good thing for aviation, and making sure that we have that strong leadership. She has a long history with the industry, and many of you know, she's asks a lot of probing, detailed questions, and really involved. So I think, you know, as we look, I do agree it'll be bipartisan. I think the question is timing, and hearing topics and when will be kind of what's stirring the pot between now and if we are in the place to have a 5-year bill by next September. So that'll kind of hold up things. But there's some key pillars if we can all kind of make sure that the committees on both sides of the aisle, both sides of the Capitol, you know, focus on maintaining a national federally based air system, as well as safety and how to innovate and create change in a safe manner.
Yeah, I'm just going to add, you know, I think it's important that you mentioned the senators are from 8 big aviation states, but also Sam Graves, either the ranking member or the chairman of the next TNI, is a pilot, and I think given the House rules for Republicans, he's got 2 years. So I can't imagine that someone who's so steeped in aviation being chair wouldn't have a bigger priority than getting an FAA bill done. So those factors make me hopeful about it. I also think there's a lot of good policy work using facts and data and information from some of the stuff that's been done over the past couple of years, like even addressing the workforce issue with the Women in Aviation Federal Advisory Committee or the Youth in Aviation Advisory Committee. These are things that we can work together on and really push the ball forward in terms of the long-term outlook of aviation in this country and the workforce and some of the other big challenges. So I'm optimistic about it, and that's the way I'm going to stay. But I think these are all important points too.
So, and Kate mentioned educating, and part of our job is going to be to educate the staff to keep this thing within the lanes.
And even, you know, there was a lot of groundwork in that 2018 bill, whether it was on, you know, workforce provisions that were largely in more of the kind of reporting task force mentality. Now, what do those recommendations, which of those recommendations do we carry forward into this bill?
One of the House staffers on a call yesterday remarked that, and I think there's something like 53 rulemakings that haven't been completed from the 2018 rule, and even if they just put those back into law, it was still a big bill. So there is a lot to do, and we know Mr. Graves will be looking at general aviation because he does love to fly. Let's pivot to the issues for next year, and Bobby, if you want to talk a little bit about the supply chain and what happened with COVID first, and then we'll talk about next year and the issues that you think that are going to be front and center.
Sure, yeah. I mean, obviously, as I mentioned, Atlas is a key, and air freight in general is a key component of our supply chain. You know, we were proud to be able to rise to the occasion along with our partners in the industry to help address the needs of the country and the world really during COVID, you know, flying billions of vaccines and PPE. Really, it was a partnership, a public-private partnership with the government, with the White House determining where things were needed, and the Department of Transportation, and of course the FAA managing the challenges that they had with the pandemic reaching the air traffic control. And so we had to work through all that. And that's not just a cargo thing, that goes across the industry. But and so, you know, even working with the governors and determining where the best place to get the resources from the planes was. So, you know, we're proud of that effort, and it's something that, you know, we learned a lot from. And in terms of just supply chains in general, as I mentioned, air cargo tends to be, an option when surface modes are having disruptions. So we saw a lot of disruptions at the ports in the past year, and so a lot of business has turned to our company. And we have our own challenges. We have labor challenges, and of course some of the issues that were mentioned before with just disruptions in general. So it really is a big part of our focus on the supply chain and just managing that flexibility that we need for us and our customers and our pilots and everybody in the system.
Kate?
Yeah, I mean, we're buying new freighters to operate our cargo fleet, so it's a growing area, even for Alaska Airlines, which has both cargo and passenger fleets. So I think I agree with Bobby. We've seen a lot of growth in that space, a lot of opportunity, but to address the supply chain and help be a part of the national economy, I think over the last 5 years, or last, however many years it's been since COVID hit, we've seen a lot of changes and dynamics, and I think what it did is really help people realize how essential aviation is to our economy and commerce and movement and people, to make sure that we can address the global needs. So.
And then pivot to next year. And some of the things, I know supply disruption is always, an issue, but the supply disruption can be caused by lots of different things. And supply to me means, are there enough flights to small communities? Or are there enough mechanics? I know we were talking yesterday about some of the creative things some of the local communities are doing to try and encourage students to get into science, technology, all of those things, and then come into the aviation system. And I know there's a lot of effort on diversity as well. So talk a little bit about that.
Absolutely. So Alaska and Horizon have partnered with Hillsborough Aero Academy in Oregon, 2 locations in Oregon, and we're creating a pilot academy. So on the pilot side of things, really trying to help look further down into the pipeline, into that recruiting, getting students into flight training schools, looking at ways to address the barriers to entry, particularly the cost, and so offering financial assistance and working with folks in Congress on other ways we can adjust that or address that barrier to entry by looking at federally backed student loans, et cetera. And I think a lot of those things will actually help us open up the diversity in the career pathway. But we also just need to do a better job of reaching into the communities that we all serve, whether that's rural Alaska, Idaho, Montana, anywhere else. I'm just naming places we fly, but and trying to make sure that we are pulling from all backgrounds, because I think when you have someone who has the aptitude to be a fantastic mechanic or a fantastic pilot, but they're coming against barriers to entry, whether that's geographic, socioeconomic, or culture, we can address those and again build off a lot of what the task forces looked at from the last FAA bill, and is there a way for industry and government to continue to partner so that we can address the workforce needs that are facing aviation. A lot of industries are having issues, but how can we kind of pull together in a collaborative way in the aviation sector, so that we have more people passionate about entering these careers.
Drew, next year?
In terms of workforce?
Workforce, FAA issues. You've got the mic. Answer.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that the preeminent disruptive issues for the reauthorization are going to be workforce. I think it's my personal expectation that small community air service is going to continue to deteriorate because of the pilot shortage, especially as business travelers return to the skies, and that puts that means less options for rural America, and that it will continue to bubble up. I think some meal and rest breaks in the Pacific Northwest, some state laws in California related to ultimately requiring more pilots and more flight attendants on aircraft could also bubble up. And an issue like that is very thorny in the context of a reauthorization, and could slow it down. And then, of course, the thing we've been dealing with as an industry for a while now is 5G. Major event this past January. In the regional space, we've got deadlines for the end of the year. We're doing our absolute best to meet those deadlines. But the broader industry has, deadlines coming in July, right smack in the middle of the reauthorization. And we're not in control of, we're responsible for equipping, but we're not in control, right? We're dependent on our supply chain partners to develop the technology, FAA to approve it and certify it, and ultimately get us to a timely manner so we can meet the deadlines. And I think, in a lot of ways, that remains to be seen because it's so far out. So, a lot of things we have to deal with in addition to, just the workforce situation.
Steve, I know American was a little bit involved in the 5G from personal experience, but also
Dipped our
that
toe in the pool.
and going forward, what do you see as issues?
Well, I want to go back to something that Kate said, and not just because Alaska's our partner and she's so smart, but talking about educating members. And I think, the education continues to be super important. And, people fly, especially members fly multiple times a week, and so they think they have some understanding of aviation. And I think it's incumbent on us to try and help provide a little bit more context. For example, I think there's a narrative out there that some of the operational challenges this summer were a result of insufficient workforce. You guys, the airlines didn't hire enough people, they didn't have enough staff, they put out schedules that were too aggressive based on the staffing they had, and that's why we reached the challenges. Well, that's not true. I know it's true for American, and I'm relatively sure it's true for our competitors, that we actually had more pilots, more flight attendants, more mechanics, more other key personnel on a per flight hour basis than we'd had before the pandemic. And it just turned out that the buffer that we created of additional workforce beyond, again, our pre-pandemic workforce models wasn't sufficient. And there's lots of reasons for that. We can talk about it. But again, it's a narrative out there about people thinking they understand why some of the challenges that we had happened. And that narrative turns out to not be right at all. I think another one that's out there, and somebody mentioned that ticket prices have increased, and that's true. But I think another narrative, and we heard a significant amount of this narrative yesterday in the Senate Judiciary Committee, is around competition and antitrust. And from my perspective, there is a great story to tell in the airline industry about hyper-intense competition. And whether you look, while airline ticket prices may be a little bit elevated right now, that's true. In 2019, the year before the pandemic, DOT's Bureau of Labor Statistics said that the average annual airfare was the lowest, inflation adjusted, the lowest it had been since they started collecting that information. If you look at the profit margin of airlines, the airline profit margin is below the average of U.S. corporations. And so I think again, there's a narrative out there. People get frustrated. People think a ticket costs more than they want it to cost, and they think that's because of competition. But when you actually look at it, competition on a city pair basis is increased now higher really than it's ever been. So back to the astute point Kate made, that we've got a lot of work to do to try and pierce some of these narratives that people are so sure about that actually turn out to be not quite right.
So, and I think all of us as former staffers, the worst day we usually had was Mondays, when the members came back and their flight was delayed, the spouse's ticket wasn't right, and most of the members believed they knew exactly how to operate an airline, and they knew what needed to be regulated. The airline industry is this odd mix of a deregulated industry that Congress thinks it can regulate. And you mentioned preemption, the California case and meal and rest break. There are starting to be some chips, and that also leads into what's going on with like advanced air mobility. And that whole segment is coming to the air traffic control system, and how does that then intersect with what you all do in a safe way? Some of the states and locals want to control those flights. That doesn't quite jive with what we all do collectively on a day-to-day basis. Do you all see that becoming a serious concern in the next FAA bill?
I think the issue of preemption is going to come up no matter what, because we have a federally run aviation system, and so there are going to be whether it's looking at drones and new advanced air mobility, et cetera, or additional new innovations in aviation. How do we make sure that we have the safest system no matter who's in that airspace? And that one of those pillars has to be, we have to have a strong federally recognized FAA that has clear authority and to make sure that one level of safety, that gold standard, is maintained and really kept treasured in this country, because it's what made us have such a complex and great aviation system.
Yeah, I mean, Atlas flies to 70 countries around the world, and we are a cargo airline, so sometimes we don't just come back to the U.S. Like, it's a route. You may go to Europe, then you may go to Asia. And I think, it's so important that the FAA maintains their airspace. And the reason I mentioned that we fly everywhere else, it's because there are different rules and regulations we have to follow, and I just can't imagine having to look at that across state lines in the U.S. And the other thing is, Kate mentioned it, the gold standard that the FAA is. I mean, a lot of these countries follow the FAA's, rules and regulations and model their civil air authorities off of that. So that's all the more reason that preemption is so critical, that we maintain that federal airspace rule.
Drew, comments?
No, I completely agree. I mean, I think, Bobby and Kate have made the great points that, ensuring preemption is directly related to continuing to assure the FAA's outstanding aviation safety record, because it's a critical tool. And frankly, I think part of the process on next reauthorization is that FAA needs to demonstrate that they want to defend it, because they didn't do it in the same way the previous administration did with regards to Bernstein, as it was moving before the Supreme Court. I mean, we're seeing it, in other areas too. I think with this is a bit outside the regionals, with Corsia and resetting the emission levels. So I hope that they in the context they step up, because having 50 different standards with meal and rest and with other encroachment as well isn't good for air service, and it makes it harder for us to provide a product to all those communities throughout the country.
Steve, how does the Bernstein decision affect how you need to operate going forward?
Well, I think there are discussions underway between airlines and each other, and between airlines and labor unions, about how we're going to react going forward, because it's not workable as it is to try and comply with the Ninth Circuit and the district judge's order there. So something's going to have to give, and I think everything that folks talked about here is right, is that there are all sorts of reasons why we need a federal rule. And if you think about the structure of the Constitution and interstate commerce, it's really hard to think of a more perfect entity that encapsulates that philosophy or that concept of interstate commerce than aviation. And so for all sorts of reasons, I think, we, and many of which have been stated, that we need to preserve and protect that preemption. But make no mistake, there are going to be challenges to that, whether it's, again, from some of our friends in labor, some of our friends who are Democratic AGs, folks who are interested in drone issues, otherwise, where there are going to be efforts to chip away at that, and I think the consequences would be disastrous.
Okay.
I want to add to that a little bit on that, because the FAA being the standard that a lot of other countries look to is really important, but it's also kind of tying back to 5G and what we've all gone through on that. We also need to have some, make sure that we have clear standards here in the United States, and then work to make sure we have that international harmonization, because ultimately our aircraft go all over the world, whether it's ours or connecting our passengers, et cetera. So we need to make sure that whether all the government agencies working together on that issue as well can take it to the aviation bodies, to the telecommunications bodies, and set those standards, because it is a role of government to set standards for interstate commerce. So.
I think perhaps, I'm not sure which industry learned a hard lesson about coordination, but the telecom industry and 5G rollout, which was allowed, it's not clear where FAA was necessarily on pushing back as hard as they perhaps should have, but the telcos spent $80 billion buying spectrum and planned on rolling 5G out, and had all the regulatory approvals, and then it turned out, guess what? We have a problem. So that internal coordination through NTIA and the other government sources, I think we've all sort of learned we need to stay on top of more than just what the FAA does and look at the other agencies. I don't know if the cargo folks are talking more to the FCC these days than they were before, but probably, I would imagine.
I do think it's important that the FAA is able to have, I worked at the FAA for a while, and it's not a political agency, and I also worked in the Secretary's office. That's a much more driven by the agenda of the White House and the agenda of the Secretary. So I think it's important that we work with Congress to kind of reinforce that, so FAA is able to carry out that role, because it's a safety role. It should really be divorced from politics or from special interests or anything like that. It really should be focused on how do we keep this aviation system the safest and the most effective for businesses and passengers. That's really, so I think that's something we should just kind of focus on in our messaging about that.
And Bobby, you when we talked the other day, you talked about FAA staffing in that context. What do you see the issues related to that? I know the FAA is advertising heavily to attract more controllers and others to the workforce, and you also have the new technologies that are coming, and I don't fully know if they're prepared to figure out what a hydrogen-powered aircraft can or can't do and how it fits in with everything else.
Yeah, well, I'll just tell you what I think, and I'd be curious what others think on this as well. But I think it's important that we, ask the FAA, what do you think you need to help make this system as efficient as possible, and work with them to support that. I mean, that's what I think our approach will be, whether it's air traffic, whether it's aviation safety, or other parts of the agency that are critical, airports, whatnot. So I think that's kind of the approach. Obviously the whole country's facing labor challenges. Atlas is facing it, other companies are facing it, and so is the government. So, and they've had a lot of changes in leadership. So new leaders are coming in and are maybe they're coming in from outside the agency, or maybe they're coming in from within the agency to rise to those roles. So I think it's important that we kind of reinvest in those relationships and ask them what they think they need, and then work together with Congress to get them that.
And back to the concept of education, I think the air traffic control challenges that we're having and that we've been experiencing are an important part of that discussion. Now, when airlines want to bring up air traffic control challenges, people say, "Oh, you're trying to blame everything that's going on wrong in the aviation sector on air traffic control," and that's not what the airlines are saying. But I think it's while it's not fair to say air traffic control is responsible for all the challenges, it's also not fair to say that there aren't really serious challenges in air traffic control. And I would, if you haven't read it, I would refer you to the speech that the new president of NATCA gave at the Aero Club in July, and he laid out, I think, the air traffic control issues as perfectly as they can be laid out. And so I'm not going to try and improve upon them, but the point is, even if the FAA says, "Oh, we have this center fully staffed," that may not be the entire story, because, well, you may have the head there and they may be staffed, but are they qualified? Do they have the training necessary not only to be an air traffic controller, but to be an air traffic controller in that center? Because if you spend 15 years as a controller in the Northeast and then you go down to Jacksonville, you then have to spend a bunch of time getting recertified in Jacksonville. So, that person the FAA may say, "Oh, we're staffed because we have that head there." But again, it's not doing anything to move airplanes efficiently through the system. And so I think, again, back to this concept of education, making sure everybody understands what actually is going on out there so that we can, make better and more thoughtful decisions.
The education piece also goes to the administration, because when you work within the agency submits its budget, its staffing requirements to DOT, which then scrubs it, meaning cuts it, and then that goes to OMB, and they do the exact same. So that when the Hill asks the FAA, "Do you have enough people?" they say, "Yes, sir, yes, ma'am," because that's what they have to do. But if you go back to their original budget submissions, they're a lot different. And they are not an intensely political organization. They know what they need. So it's just something for all of us to think about as we talk about educating people about what they need. I think we've got a couple of minutes, 5 minutes left. last comments from us, and we'll open up for a couple of questions.
Yeah, just on the workforce, I think we're really looking forward to working on this at Atlas and supporting the FAA has a workforce grant program that some of our partners like Vaughn College have received, and we think that's a great initiative, and we want to work with Congress to continue supporting that. And we're also working on our own partnerships. It's really a big priority to build the workforce of the future more now more than ever. So that's something we're looking forward to working on with our colleagues, including the education bill to give greater student loans to aspiring pilots, which will help lower the cost and bring more people into that great industry.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be an exciting next year, and we're going to be having we'll also be spending a lot of time together and talking about a lot of big issues. But I think it's exciting, and we also have, built on a lot of change and growth in the industry in these last couple of years, and so kind of looking at those as opportunities going forward. I think I'm excited, but I'm a nerd, so.
Drew?
Yeah, no, I think it's certainly going to be an exciting, fast-paced time. Given when it's we got to get this done by the end of make progress on it by the end of September of 2023. Our industry is facing some critical challenges, but it's also a very exciting time in the industry as well, given the new entrants, given the investments to decrease carbon emissions across our sector. And I found that staff are always excited and willing to engage on these discussions and these topics, but there's a whole lot of education we have to do, per all the points that have already been raised, and so our work will be cut out for us.
Others have talked about it already, but I can't come to an RAA event and not talk about the pilot supply challenges. And so while I mentioned earlier that we have more pilots on a per flight hour basis than we did before the pandemic, that's true, but it shouldn't distract from the notion that there is a critical pilot supply challenge. And we do have the equivalent of 100 or more regional aircraft from our wholly owned regional subsidiaries that are sitting on the ground because we don't have enough pilots to fly them. And the challenges associated with the 1,500 hours necessary to become a regional first officer, and then the additional 1,000 hours necessary to become a regional captain, and the intense demand for those regional captains at the mainline carriers all that together is causing really significant challenges that is affecting not only American Airlines and our wholly owned regional carriers, but also entities throughout the system. And so that continues to be something that we need to focus lots of time and energy on. Some of the potential solutions have already been talked about here. There, of course, are others, but I couldn't come to an RAA event and not at least touch on that a little bit.
I know that's probably greatly appreciated by the audience. Two comments from me, and then we'll open it up. One is, and Drew and I have had this conversation, I'm not a mathematician, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a rocket scientist.
True.
But and Steve knows this. But if the government says that we need 14,500 or 18,000 pilots, new pilots a year, and we're only giving out 6,500 tickets a year, and there are retirements on top of that, and the airline industry wants to grow, and we all want to fly after COVID, something doesn't line up. So those that say that there isn't a problem, I don't get the math. That's my comment, and we will continue to make that argument to communities around the country. The other one issue that we haven't talked about that is going to crop up is the tax structures along the airline industry and what happens with the new technologies that come in. And this is going to happen in the auto industry too, as you go from a gas tax to electric vehicles. But it is something that the Finance Committee and the FAA and the industry is going to have to think through if we're going to do a 5-year bill. With that, any questions from the audience before Faye gives us the hook?
We've got a few minutes, but I've got just a house question. You had mentioned that, Kate, you spoke to it, and a couple of you have alluded to higher education. And I think that's something that, maybe we'll see some bill this year. But can you tell us a little bit about that and what its track might be? And I also want to take this opportunity to thank all of you for your support for that. It's such an important way to give people access to this career.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you look at how again, going back to those barriers to entry, particularly on the pilot space, the cost is something that we can address. If you look back, we were hiring out of the military for most of our pilot workforce across the industry until, I don't know when it tipped to majority civilian path, but it did in the last couple decades. But the education system didn't keep up with that change. And so the government was investing a lot of money in the early decades of the last century. That sounds weird to say, but and making those investments in training. But then you didn't see the student loan opportunities for low interest loans take over, or schools necessarily keep up with how to finance that when they didn't have a military pathway, or and then I think you're seeing airlines like Alaska, Horizon, and others, going deeper into the pipeline to try and partner with schools directly and help build up the pipeline so that we can have more of a stable look at what the future of the workforce looks like in the pilot space. But I think the reality is we need to make some adjustment to our higher education system so that we can actually see these civilian pathways be clear. A high schooler can go to their school counselor and I say, I want to be a pilot. I really love it. My high school in Alaska growing up had someone who offered flight training after class or after school. There's vocational opportunities in high school to build that interest. But then when they sit down with their parents to look at how do I finance my career future, and they come up against a brick wall when it comes to finances, I think that's just keeping a huge amount of people that have passion, aptitude, and interest in becoming pilots that we're just leaving untapped. And so the government has a role in that. There's all these incentives to go and become doctors or other, and support and financial support to become all these other careers. And it's just not quite there in the pilot space. And so I think it's just an open area of interest, and I think it's one we can all work together on. So.
Yeah, no, what makes it, becoming a pilot is always going to cost a lot of money, right? But the beauty of increasing federal student loans is that the approval process for students and older individuals is so much easier. You're approved. Either it's subsidized or unsubsidized, and so you have access to the funds, and it creates a financial pathway. And then once you're done and you graduate, the other beauty of it is because of income-based repayment, your payments are going to be manageable, and your maximum payment is going to be based on how much you make. So while you're building time as a CFI, you're not making the same level of payment that you're going to be making as a captain at a regional airline. So your payments grow with you as you make more money. And of course, we all know just how much wages have grown throughout the industry, how astounding they are, and so there is a way for it to be paid back. These professions are money good, and this is how we open up the profession to more and more people, because we can have the high wages on the other side, but unless we give people a pathway and also stoke the interest as well, but unless you give them a pathway, there's no way to access it, and we are doing ourselves a disservice to the people, to the communities we serve, by not creating a pathway for the young people who live there to get into this career path. And in terms of vehicles for it, the higher ed reauthorization is always up. It seems to be perpetually up for reauthorization. That's a vehicle for it. But I think the big goal is here, we've got to get it attached to some large vehicle, appropriations package, FAA reauthorization, something big, which really requires a concerted effort by everybody in the industry to go talk to their members of Congress and educate them about how we need to get this done as soon as possible.
And not just the members on the Transportation Committee, but in the education space who maybe have never had a flight school come to the Education Committee and say, this is what I need to be successful and get, graduate my students for really amazing careers. So.
It's also, even at the high school level, getting, as you said, getting kids interested in doing this, because they're used to playing on computers at this point. They're much more likely to, become a drone pilot and sit at a desk and play. It's essentially a video game versus do what we're talking about.
We're in this quirky spot. I spent a lot of time when I was working in state government focused on this problem about, we need to make sure, there are lots of students who aren't interested or well suited for a 4-year college program. And so what do we do to make sure that there are opportunities available for those sorts of people so that they can have careers and raise their families in dignity and security? And decades ago, after the Second World War, they go and work in a factory, and you could without a 4-year degree and raise your family in dignity and security. And that appears to be slipping away, except that here in the airline industry, we have those jobs, and we have those opportunities to be pilots, we have those opportunities to be mechanics and otherwise, and not only do we have the opportunities, but we're desperate for more people to want to become pilots and want to become mechanics and otherwise. And so there seems to be a really great opportunity for the airline industry and government to partner together. We need those people who aren't necessarily interested in the four-year degree. Government is interested in creating those opportunities, and so we've just got to come together and figure out, Drew and Kate talked a lot about the financing pieces. Those are all super important. And the other piece, I think that where we've got a lot of work to do is making sure people are aware that that's an opportunity that it's available to them. Again, if you come from a low-income community in an inner city, the idea of becoming an airline pilot might not ever even occur to you. That you have no idea that that's something you could be. And so that's a problem we can help to address, and working with our partners who are governors, who are mayors, who are county officials, who are members of Congress, to try and sell that information. Just one quick anecdote on that is that just a few weeks ago, American Airlines celebrated the 100th anniversary of a woman named Bessie Coleman, who was the first African-American woman to earn a pilot's license. And we actually celebrated the 101st anniversary. We were supposed to do it 100 years in, but it got canceled because of the pandemic. So we had a flight. Everybody who was involved in that flight on the American Airlines side was an African-American woman. Pilots, flight attendants, mechanics, dispatchers, gate agents, ticket agents, ramp workers. The whole flight was crewed by African-American women. It's a great story, it's a neat story, but it also, thank you, but it also gave us an opportunity to tell that story loudly on some of the national news networks to deal with this very issue. So the hope is that a young African-American girl sitting at home would watch this news story and say, wait a minute, I can be a pilot? Wait a minute, I can be an airline mechanic? And we just need to, that's one tiny example, which is a neat one, but we need to think about how to create fire hoses like that so that people understand that these are careers that they can do, and we shouldn't be shutting ourselves off to young girls, to people of color and otherwise who can fill these positions capably and honorably and create wealth for them and their families.
Well said. That's it. All right, we're done.
Sorry to take the last word.
We got the hook, but that was well done.